I would like to thank the Sylvia Ioannou Foundation for making this whole thing possible and for inviting me. It is a great honor and pleasure to be here. Because you all have just had your lunch and are likely a little bit tired, I want to start with just a story, not a happy story, but a story all the same. In 1624, local officials in the Ottoman Adriatic port town of Nova, present-day Herceg-Novi in Montenegro, dispatched sealed letters hand-delivered by their emissaries to the Corsairing leadership in the North African port cities of Tunis and Algiers. The letters contained an invitation to conduct a joint expedition that spring against the neighboring Venetian coastal town of Piracy, located only 30 kilometers away from Nova inside the Bay of Kotor. For years, the residents of Nova and Piracy have been trading raids and reprisals by land and sea, part of a wider pattern of small-scale piratical violence and banditry common along the Adriatic frontier between Venice, the Ottoman Empire, and Habsburg domains. After the most recent raid ascribed to the Perastini, Ottoman officials in Nova decided to go and do more than get even. With the help of the Corsairs of Algiers and Tunis, they could deliver a decisive blow to their neighbors in Piracy and enrich themselves in the process. For Algiers and Tunis, this formal and seemingly official invitation, not to mention their perennial hatred of Venice, was justification enough for embarking on an Adriatic cruise with the advent of the sea season. So it was that in late June 1624, a 13-ship fleet from Algiers and Tunis arrived in the Adriatic and joined forces with pilots and fighting men from Nova. Landing first at Piracy, the primary objective of the expedition, the pirates took 443 women and children captive, as well as quantities of goods, livestock, and cash. Its mission in Piracy accomplished, the fleet then headed south to raid the Venetian-held Ionian Islands. At a brief stop on Corfu, they took 13 women and 3 men captive and took a number of merchant ships plying the straits. At Paxos and Antipaxos, the pirates made off with 264 captives. They then paused to sack Kefalonia. The ships discharged some 2,000 fighting men who laid waste to the island, burning and pillaging and carrying off a large number of Venetian subjects. Neither Venetian nor Ottoman officials after the fact could offer an estimate. Later, officials in Algiers and Tunis would justify their actions on Kefalonia as self-defense, claiming that a number of islanders on the shore had discharged their arquebuses at the passing fleet. Self-defense. By this point, a Venetian fleet had been sent to intercept the pirates, but they weighed anchor as soon as they caught sight of the approaching Venetian relief force and escaped unharmed. The more than 700 Venetian subjects the pirates carried off were sold into slavery at various Ottoman ports, both in the Ottoman province of Bosnia and in North Africa. The brazen pirate cruise and the involvement of local Ottoman officials from the Adriatic in its planning and execution led to outrage in both Venice and Istanbul. Some amount of frontier violence, the occasional seizure of ships or slaves, might be forgiven, if not condoned, but most Ottoman officials in Istanbul seemingly agreed that this attack went beyond the pale. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the legal side of Ottoman corsairing in the Eastern Mediterranean and how officials in Istanbul and Ottoman North Africa defined what constituted a legally justified raid and how they attempted to justify that definition to each other. Focusing on the legal and diplomatic aftermath of the 1624 raid that I've just described to you, reconstructed on the basis of Ottoman and Venetian sources, I will outline the treaty law shared between the Ottoman Empire and Venice that prohibited piracy and the ways in which the Ottoman center attempted, in religious legal terms, to convince the North African corsairing leadership to honor its commitments under the treaty. Although these attempts were ultimately unsuccessful, raids like that in 1624 became more, not less common. The discussion itself has important implications for our understanding of the legal and diplomatic history of the 17th century Mediterranean, and the broader question of where the line was and who got to draw it between corsairing and piracy. So many of the questions we've already been talking about today and we'll probably continue to talk about tomorrow. The 1624 raid on Venetian possessions in the Adriatic and Ionian seas was certainly an unambiguous violation of the imperial treaty, known as Ahname, which governed relations between the two powers at peace since 1573. The Ahname contains several reciprocal clauses with anti-piracy articles obligating them both to combat piracy whenever possible and guaranteeing the safety of each other's ships, shores, and subjects. Venetian captives taken in contravention of the treaty were to be found and freed, and provided they had not converted to Islam, handed over to the nearest Venetian representative. Likewise, stolen ships and cargoes were to be returned, or failing that, restitution provided. After 1595, as attacks on Venetian targets originating in Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli became more common, the treaty language specifically mentioned North Africa as among the places from which Venetian captives must be found and freed, meaning that the littoral was not considered exempt, at least by the Sultan, from the treaty's requirements. Similar articles made their way into the Ahname subsequently concluded with France, England, and the Netherlands in the late 16th and 17th centuries. By the 1620s, however, as the Ottoman center struggled with dynastic crisis, financial troubles, and Cossack attacks that threatened the imperial capital itself, the predations of the North African Corsairs became increasingly audacious in the central and eastern Mediterranean. Although theoretically bound by the Ahname's guarantees, without fear of serious consequences from Istanbul, the leadership in North Africa routinely disregarded them. In recognition of the fact that the Ottoman center could not fully restrain its North African subjects, the Venetians had already been granted the right to defend themselves from North African pirate attacks and to pursue and destroy those who threatened them. But for those corsairs who relied upon the justification of holy war for their raids and lived by the customary code of reciprocal violence, Venice's vigorous self-defense efforts and its policy of beheading captured corsairs only invited more attacks by way of retaliation and reprisal. Thus, while the 1624 Adriatic Ionian raid was shocking, it was not at all surprising. In the aftermath of the raids, the Bailo, that is the title for the Venetians' ambassador to the Sublime Porte, Zorzi Justinian, met with all the leading Ottoman officials to coordinate a response to the incident. This included the Grand Vizier, the Grand Vizier's deputy, the Imperial Admiral known as the Kapitan Pasha, and the Sheikhul Islam, the Mufti of Istanbul and the Ottoman's chief religious legal authority. Their first move came in late August 1624 when Husrev Pasha, the newly appointed Beylerbey of Algiers, this is nominally the provincial governor, but in reality a largely ceremonial position by this point, was sent to his post carrying an imperial decree ordering the Divan of Algiers to free the prisoners and not to attack Venice, and a fatwa, a religious legal opinion, of the Sheikhul Islam declaring that it was illegal for all Muslims to attack the friends of the Sultan. Next, in October 1624, decrees were dispatched to Bayram Pasha, the provincial governor of Bosnia, in whose jurisdiction Nova fell, that's where this whole thing started, and to key officials in Tunis, ordering them to locate the stolen goods, find the culprits, and ensure that nothing be done in contravention of the Ahname in the future. These decrees were paired with personal letters from all the most important Ottoman officials. And those meant for Tunis were conveyed personally by Avdi Pasha, their newly appointed Beylerbey, just as Husrev Pasha had done for Algiers. The religious question: what was a religiously acceptable raid that constituted Gaza or holy war, and what was not, was at the center of the issue. As the Imperial Admiral, the Kapitan Pasha, declared in his letter to Yusuf Dey, who was in charge in Tunis, whom he called a Ghazi, remember that word from earlier, par excellence, even as he disparaged the Ionian raiders as rebel pirates, it was not a Halal Gaza, a religiously permissible raid, to attack Venetians as they might other enemy infidels. These are not the enemy infidels you're looking for. Venetians are different. Likewise, the Sheikhul Islam stressed in his letter to these officials that there was peace between the Sublime Porte and Venice, and because the Ahname said they would not be molested, it was a violation of Islamic law to do so. So he urged the governor to obey the Sultan's orders, fight against piracy, and give whatever aid was necessary to the Venetians. This was not forthcoming, shockingly. These combined efforts worked on Bayram Pasha in Bosnia. They went nowhere in North Africa, where the newly appointed Beylerbeys quickly discovered they had neither the power nor the incentive to upset the established order. Okay, that's not yet. While the aforementioned decrees and letters were crossing the Mediterranean, Justinian and his superiors in Venice had dispatched an Ottoman subject Venetian dragoman, Giovanni Battista Salvago, to North Africa to coordinate the release of the captives held there. However, Unlike his English, French, and Dutch colleagues on similar missions, Salvago was not authorized to pay ransoms. He would have to rely on the force of the Sultan's words alone to free the slaves and see the Ahadname respected North Africa. Salvago's initial confidence quickly faded after his arrival in Algiers in February 1625, as it became clear that the other trading nations' habit of paying ransoms and their growing willingness to treat directly with the North African leadership had diluted the power of the Sultan's commands. It did not help, again, that the Venetians were particularly loathed for their uncompromising punishment of captured Corsairs. After months of fruitless negotiations, Salvago left Algiers empty-handed, arriving in Tunis in late June to an even frostier reception. When he succeeded in having the decrees read before the entire council in Tunis, they threatened to burn him alive. But, as had happened in Algiers, the members of the Tunisian Divan also chose to justify their recent actions to the dragoman and to the two Ottoman envoys who had accompanied him. They accused Venice of complicity with the Corsairs of Malta and detailed a decades-long history of perceived wrongs perpetrated by the Venetian navy against the Corsairs of Tunis. They claimed that they had been formally invited to sack Piracy by Ottoman officials in Nova, who had been wronged by their neighbors. And they argued, rather disingenuously, that the attack on Kefalonia was unplanned and legitimate self-defense. Moreover, they added, custom and their ancient sultanic privileges entitled them to fall upon all those who did not obey their commands at sea. That is, if you didn't stop when they said stop, they had the right to take you. For all these reasons, the 1624 raids and the seizure of the captives were legal and right, and if the Venetians wanted their subjects back, they should ransom them as their co-religionists did. Surely, if the Sublime Porte understood the true state of affairs, it would not be taking the Venetian side. Since the Ottoman envoys would not leave without some sort of response for the Sultan and his council, the Tunisian leadership decided to send a delegation of their own to Istanbul to represent their views and assert the legitimacy of their actions. As Salvago prepared to return to Venice empty-handed, 6 Tunisian notables set sail for Istanbul, bringing with them one of 2 recently captured Maltese galleys. They would present their prize in triumph and then mount their defense. The arrival of the Tunisian delegation in Istanbul in early January 1626 provided an opportunity for the Bailo and his Ottoman supporters to press the issue once more. The representatives from Tunis had clearly expected a warmer welcome than the one they received, for they were soon faced by the Bailo and his dragomans, an angry imperial admiral, and a number of other Ottoman officials, all of whom were attempting to prevail upon the Tunisians to obey the Sultan's wishes, free the slaves, and stop attacking the Venetians. The Tunisians, of course, were defiant. In response to accusations regarding a number of more recent seizures of Venetian ships, they argued that they had only done so in reprisal and to compensate themselves for the loss of several of their galleots to Venetian patrols. The Bailo retorted that Venice's taking of the galleots was solely due to the Tunisians' piracy and was justly done in accordance with the rules of the treaty. The meeting ended without resolution. But the continuing Tunisian intransigence in the presence of the Ottoman officials and the responses of the delegation to the points raised by the Bailo and the admiral laid the groundwork for the next round of diplomatic maneuvers. In order to debunk the Tunisians' excuses, the admiral informed the Bailo's dragoman that he would procure a fatwa from the Sheikh al-Islam, Zakaria-Zadeh Yahya Effendi. By the time he wrote his dispatch of January 24th, 1626, so some time has passed here, the Bailo Justinian had received a copy of the fatwa. The opinion he obtained was favorable, notwithstanding the contrary efforts of the Tunisian delegation, which had attempted to sway the mufti of their side when they learned what the admiral was up to. Instead, their counter-arguments had provided fodder for the opinion itself, which broke down the lines of their reasoning by which they had, in Justinian's words, maintained the justice of their corsi against Venetian ships and shores. The fatwa found that the Tunisians' actions were, again, as Justinian understood it, illicit according to their laws, not just the invasion of the places and ships, but the taking of the subjects, and that the Venetians' taking of some of their galleots was not a reason for sustaining a corso against us. The Sheikh al-Islam's response, comprised of 3 interconnected fatwas, reveals the state's total claim to the banner of holy war, the rejection of the validity of retaliation for a prior attack if it would violate a pre-existing treaty, and the absolute illegality of enslavement of captives taken in unauthorized raids. The initial fatwa, written with the brevity and simplicity and absence of identifying detail characteristic to 17th century Ottoman fatwas, sets the stage. The Sultan has already concluded a peace treaty with the infidels, in this case the Venetians, when a frontier party crosses a border to pillage and take capitals. Question: The ruler and the infidels of a place of the abode of war reconcile and make a truce with his majesty, the sultan of the Ghazis and the mujahids, that is the holy warriors. May God Almighty prolong his domain till the end of days. Without informing the center, that's Istanbul, and when none of the necessary things were present, an expeditionary force from the Muslims arrived and, in contravention of the original order, raided and pillaged a number of the places in their territory. If they captured some of the infidels, can those captured infidels legally be enslaved and sold to another, and owned, and used? Answer, no. So the fatwa states the problem fairly precisely. The raiders have contravened an imperial order to respect the truce, and they have committed the offense of acting without first consulting the central government and obtaining its permission. That is the definition of being a privateer, right? The necessary things are the sultan's explicit commands to attack the Venetians. So the contrast between the lofty language affirming the sultan's holy warrior credentials and the implicit condemnation of the raiders' actions reinforces the message that the initiation and prosecution of holy war is the exclusive domain of the sultan. The fatwa is also quite explicit about the captives, so that no that we get at the end encompasses not just the capture and enslavement, but also the sale, the possession, and the use of those captured infidels. That is, there is no wiggle room here. But what are the Tunisians' excuses? That they were compensating themselves for an earlier Venetian attack on one of their own vessels. What of their claims that it was the custom of the North African ports to wage maritime holy war against the infidels wherever they found them? Yahya Effendi's first follow-up question addresses these arguments and excuses. In that case, they are accustomed to overwhelming and raiding those places and capturing its infidels. And when it was asked of the Mufti, they merely responded, that is the Tunisians, that previously some of the infidels of that place had taken a ship from among the ships of the Muslims, and that's why we did what we did. If solely in consequence of that action they captured them, can they legally enslave and own those captives? Answer, if the truce is ratified, no. So again, this fatwa categorically rejects the validity of reprisal as a justification for initiating a raid against the territory of a power with which the Sultan wishes to have peace. And of course, relations along the Ottoman's maritime frontier, and especially along the Adriatic, Ionian, Morean coasts, were characterized by a pattern of raids and counter-raids, just like this. This fatwa meant to challenge the dynamic and strip it of its legitimacy, insisting that sultanic permission must be obtained in order to raid and enslave the infidels. The fatwa admonishes local officials, pirates, and slave raiders not to do what they were accustomed to doing. Nevertheless, obviously, this raid has already been carried out. So whether or not the raiders had believed that theirs was a legitimate reprisal, the fact remained that the captives had in fact been taken. So, now that they've been taken and distributed and sold off, what's to be done about them? The final fatwa in the series addresses this question. In that case, that party sold some of the infidels that they had captured to Zayd and Amr. These are our two of our standard aliases. When the officials went to take the slaves from their possession and free them because their enslavement was not permissible, can Zayd and Amr legally prevent the slaves being taken from their possession just by saying, we bought them from the ones who captured them with our own money and paying for the enslavement? Answer, no. So this fatwa actually represents what was Ottoman administrative practice. Following the complaints of the Venetians or others, and this includes Ottoman subjects who were legally enslaved sometimes, orders would be sent from the imperial center to the local judge or other officials to investigate the matter, identify those responsible for the abrogation of the treaty, locate and free the captives and slaves, and allow them to return home. No ransom was to be demanded, and no compensation given. This fatwa makes it clear that just because the buyers are technically blameless in the matter, their enslavement of the possession of the captives is no less illegal. I should mention here that 17th century Ottoman fatwa collections contain dozens of fatwas concerning piracy, including how and whom to raid, and how to adjudicate the inevitable property disputes that followed piratical seizures of ships, cargo, and slaves. That is to say, fatwas on matters like these were in no way unusual. By February 7th, 1626, a new batch of letters and imperial decrees based on the arguments contained in the fatwas was ready. Sultan Murad IV's own lengthy decree referenced the fatwas explicitly and repeatedly to explain why it was absolutely necessary to free those Venetian slaves immediately and refrain from further attacks on Venetian subjects. All these documents were then presented to the Tunisians in Istanbul and were also dispatched directly to Tunis by messenger around the middle of the month. That messenger had orders to remain in Tunis indefinitely and coordinate the release of the Venetian slaves still held there, which is probably the most thankless job the Ottomans could come up with for this poor guy. There is a common diplomatic purpose here. Venice wanted the return of its subjects, as well as of its captured ships and stolen merchandise, and it wanted the Tunisian and Algerian attacks on its shipping to cease. The Ottoman central government, while interested in honoring the stipulations of its agreements with Venice, had to deal with the broader implications of the North African officials and Adriatic officials' violations of the treaty. The flagrant disregard for imperial authority, the failure to maintain even the semblance of respect for sultanic sovereignty over their military and foreign affairs, and the North Africans' claims for religious and customary legal justification required a vigorous Ottoman diplomatic response. All the more so since a military response in this period was not a practical option. It was thus left to the Sheikh al-Islam as semi-independent jurisconsult and religious legal authority to demonstrate that the Tunisians' violation of the Sultan's peace was against God's will as much as that of the Sultan. These efforts, while demonstrative of Istanbul's views on what constituted legal maritime raiding, were insufficient to arrest the changing dynamic in the Mediterranean. With the Sublime Porte's blessing, England's ambassador, Thomas Roe, successfully negotiated treaties directly with Algiers and Tunis in 1625 and obtained the release of hundreds of English captives. The French and the Dutch soon followed suit. Although these treaties were repeatedly broken and renegotiated and bad faith abounded, when the parties did abide them, they removed English, French, or Dutch flagships from the target lists. They also further weakened the influence of the Sublime Porte in North Africa. By 1627, the ambassadors of England, France, and the Netherlands had all agreed that there was no point in continuing to press the pirate issue at the Sublime Porte. This left Venice all alone among the Mediterranean trading space, making, as Thomas Roe said it, the flag of St. Mark the very temptation of a pirate. For Venice would not scape under the banner if it did swim in the Mediterranean. Only Venice did not abandon port in favor of direct diplomacy with North Africa, leaving those merchants who still sailed under the Venetian flag increasingly exposed to attack. And attacks only skyrocketed, causing absurd amounts of damage. In the 20 years between 1618 and 1638, just the biggest ships caused 5 million gurush of damage. For comparison's sake, the annual revenue of the port of Iskenderun was 40,000 gurush. So that's some serious money. The cost of North African piracy were not Venice's alone to bear, so long as the Sublime Porte remained legally and financially responsible for the actions of its North African subjects. Thus, as Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli began to conduct their own foreign relations with the Atlantic states, Istanbul began looking to formally spin off that responsibility. After the restoration of peace with Venice, following the end of the long war for Crete in 1669, the new anti-piracy provisions of the Ahname disavowed North Africa, stripping it of the protections of Ottoman subjecthood. No one pretended anymore that Istanbul could or would affect change there, and the failed attempts to do so only damaged the Sultan's legitimacy. Henceforth, the Ottomans maintained their obligation to deny pirates markets and shelter and to return stolen goods and slaves, but they stepped back from interdiction assurances and restitution guarantees. So by 1670, the Ottoman government had adopted the blanket view that pirates were the common enemy of all.